Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast. Hackers are people too, using cyber deception to combat the human element of cyber attacks. My name is Randall Jones. I'm the Offensive Operations Marketing Manager here at SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Kevin Fiscus. Kevin is the founder and lead consultant for Cyber Defense Advisors, where he performs security and risk assessments, vulnerability and penetration testing, as well as security program design. As a SANS instructor, Kevin has taught just about every single popular SANS course we have, including Security Essentials, of course, our most popular course, Security 504, Hacker Techniques and Incident Handling, our penetration courses covering network, web, and mobile. Those are all separate 6-day courses, plus even Forensics 508, Advanced Incident Response, as well as our training program for the CISSP certification. So quite a lot of experience. He's now brought his considerable experience to authoring the newly rewritten Security 550, Cyber Deception, Attack Detection, Disruption, and Active Defense. And just want to mention that if you have any questions for Kevin during the webcast, please enter them into the questions window at any time. Please note that our webcast is being recorded and will be available for viewing later in the SANS webcast registration page, as well as in your SANS account under My Webcasts. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kevin.
Awesome. Thank you, Randall. Appreciate it. Very, very nice. So welcome, everyone. Glad that you guys, if you are tuning in live, glad you could join us live. And if you are catching this in a recorded format, glad you could take a few minutes out of your day to understand that, yes, indeed, hackers are people too. So really, this entire presentation, as Randall had mentioned, we are about to relaunch the Security 550 class. And so this is a class focused on cyber deception. And so the content that we are about to go through is actually or consists of a couple of excerpts from that actual class. So you're getting a preview of some of the first content that you're going to get in day one on this, from that class. So, I'd love to get any questions that you have. There is a questions window that is available in the GoToWebinar platform. So if you have questions, please do not hesitate to drop those in there. If you have thoughts, if you are listening to this and you're like, I don't think that that's correct, and you want to push back, I am open for all of that stuff. So welcome, and we're just going to go ahead and jump into this. Now, when we talk about hackers being people too, before I get into the actual slide portion, the general concept that we're going to be talking about has to do with the fact that when we look at security, when we look at cyber security or information security or network security or whatever you want to call it, one of the things that we typically look at security as sort of a two-pronged thing. We have cyber security and we have physical security. And while they are not directly related, they influence each other significantly. So if you've got really, really good cybersecurity controls, but you've got really bad physical security, the bad guys can get in. And conversely, if you've got fantastic physical security, but you've got really bad cybersecurity controls, the bad guys can get in. Well, that's all well and good, but when we look at physical security controls, those are controls that are specifically designed to combat physical attacks. And we're all very familiar with those, right? Cameras monitoring things, door locks, other types of access control systems, that kind of stuff. And those make sense to us. Now, when we talk about cybersecurity, this is where things get a little bit interesting, because cybersecurity controls, whether we're talking about firewalls, IDS, antivirus, endpoint detection and response, monitoring, all of these types of things, SIM technologies, whatever, all of these technologies are focused exclusively on the tools and utilities that are used by the attackers. That said, so we can combat the technology used by the attackers, and we can combat attempts at physical access. Well, because we can do that, the attackers have changed tactics. And one of the most common strategies that attackers have is social engineering. whether that be verbal social engineering, in-person social engineering, email-based phishing, spear phishing, all of that kind of stuff. We're trying to the attackers are not necessarily attacking technology, but they are attacking the mind, the human being that is a user or an administrator or whatever in the target environment. So they are attacking a human, maybe not physically attacking a human, but psychologically attacking a human. The problem is that while that is an incredibly common and very effective attack strategy, we have very few controls designed to kind of look at psychology and human beings. We have training, right? We have security awareness training and those types of things. But even in the best of circumstances, people can fall victim to psychological manipulation. Now, that said, what we don't have, or what we haven't really had to date, is the reverse of that, right? We haven't had a way to combat the attackers from more of a human or psychological perspective. And that is what we are sort of leading up to with our presentation today. Now, before we jump into some of what the answers are, I want to talk about some of the problems we have. Now, I pulled some numbers off of a couple of relatively recent sort of data breach studies. One is the M-Trends report, which was originally published by Mandiant. They've been purchased by FireEye. The other one is the Ponemon Institute cost of a data breach report. Now, in both of those reports, they talk about the amount of time that takes defenders to detect and respond to attackers. If you look at the M-Trends report, it is 56 days on average it takes to detect and respond to attackers. So basically, the better part of 2 months, the attackers are on our network before we discover that they are there and can effectively respond to them. Now, this is even worse when we look at the difference between an internally originated breach and an externally originated breach. With an externally originated breach, we're talking about 141 days. So what is that? Basically over 4 months. Now, when we look at the Ponemon Institute, at least in their 2019 study, I didn't update it for the 2020 yet. I'm in the process of doing that. But in 2019, their number, the mean time to identify a data breach is 197 days. Sorry, that was in 2018, 206 days in 2019. That's not only a huge problem, but it's going in the wrong direction, right? It's taking us longer. And then we talk about the mean time to contain a breach. Once we identify it, how long does it take to get it under control? In 2018, their number was 69 days. In 2000, oopsie, a little typo there, but in 2019, that number jumped up to 73 days. So when we look at this, I've had people ask me what the big difference between the numbers in the M-Trends report and the Ponemon Institute. Again, I don't have all of the detailed specifics what we used to generate the reports, but what I can tell you is the M-Trends report is taken off of breaches that FireEye investigated. And generally speaking, if you're an organization that is contracting with FireEye or previously with Mandiant, you probably have a little bit better security controls than just an average company. Whereas the Ponemon Institute study was just a broad survey of a bunch of different organizations. But the long story short is it takes us far too long to detect and respond to breaches. Now we get into why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because of cost. Pulling from the Ponemon Institute cost of a data breach study, when we look at the overall cost of data breaches, there are some really big numbers that get thrown around. Over $3 million is the average breach, but ultimately, I don't like that number at all. It's not that I don't, I don't like to use that number because no organization is average. So the number that I like to look at is the cost per compromised record. So when we look at some of that, so when we look, for example, at the 2019, we're talking about almost $4 million is the average cost of a data breach. And oh, by the way, that changes significantly by industry. If you're in healthcare, it's over $6 million. If you're in the financial industry, it's just under $6 million, that kind of stuff. So we're talking about some really, really big numbers here in terms of what the total cost of a data breach is. Now, that said, the reason why I talked about the time it takes to detect and respond to a breach is because, again, that Ponemon Institute study, which I quote quite frequently, also did an analysis of what are the factors that can influence the cost of a data breach. What are the factors that can make the data breach cost less, and what are the factors that ultimately result in it costing more? And one of the things that has been absolutely consistent year after year after year is that the longer it takes to detect and respond to an attack, the more it's going to cost us. So if we look at some of the numbers, the 2019 numbers, if it takes over 200 days to detect and respond to a breach, that average breach cost is $4.56 million. It's a 36.5% increase. Now, on the other hand, if we can do it in less than 200 days, that number drops down to $3.34 million. So we're literally saving over $1 million per breach on average, of course, if we can detect and respond to breaches in an effective way. So we could tell that, just generally speaking, we have a problem. And if we look at some of those numbers and some of the trends that we talked about, particularly some of the Ponemon Institute trends, we're not getting better. We're not increasing the speed at which we can detect and respond to attacks. The attackers are getting on our networks. The breakout time, or the time that takes from the time that they gain initial access to the time that they basically pwn our entire network, is going way down, but it's taking us longer to detect and respond to those breaches. And so when we look at it, and there's an oft quoted saying about insanity being doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. What we have been doing has not been working. There is no question that whatsoever what we have not been doing hasn't been working. Well, what I'm here to tell you is there is an actual answer that can significantly improve our capabilities from a detection and response perspective, and even from a stopping attackers in the first place. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Now, one of the ways that I want to look at this is utilizing a concept that many of you may be familiar with, and it's called OODA, or an OODA loop is what it's oftentimes referred to as. So OODA is an acronym that was coined by United States Air Force Colonel John Boyd, and he created this for fighter pilots. So if you're a fighter pilot and you're engaged in a dogfight with some other pilot, so we talk about OODA. You have to observe what's going on. You have to notice the situation. You have to orient your thinking and your processing of that information to the specifics of the situation. You then need to make a decision about what you're going to do about the situation, and then you have to act. So OODA: observe, orient, decide, and act. And what it boils down to is, generally speaking, the fighter pilot that can complete that OODA loop, that can complete the observe, orient, decide, and act first, they take a nice, happy flight home. The pilot that completes that loop second is generally taking a long, slow parachute ride to the ground because they've lost and they've had to eject. Now, when we talk about this observe, orient, decide, and act, it does have a lot of applicability to outside of the world of fighter pilots. So I want you to think about this. So I close your eyes. I don't care if you close your eyes or not, but I want you to think about where you live. Think about your home. Now, imagine that it is the middle of the night, right? There is a big storm that has knocked out the power. There's no light whatsoever. It is pitch black out. You can't see anything. And then suddenly, though, you're sleeping and a sound wakes you up. You hear something. Now, if you live in your own home relatively regularly, you are going to be familiar with the sounds that you would normally run into, right? Is it your cat jumping off the counter? Is it your kid going to the restroom? Whatever, that type of thing. Now, imagine then that you hear a noise and you realize that that noise is not a normal noise. There is a problem, right? Somebody is in your house. Well, because you are familiar with your home, just by hearing that noise, you could probably do a pretty good job of sort of locating where that noise sounded like it was coming from. Because you're familiar with your house, you can make rapid decisions. So you heard the noise, observe, orient. You sort of physically positioned it. You're familiar with the situation. You realize the power's out, all of that kind of stuff. Then you can make a quick decision. I'm going to leave my house. I'm going to call the police. I'm going to go check it out, grab a baseball bat, whatever it is that you're going to do. You can make that decision and you can then act on it relatively quickly. Now, assuming there's an intruder in your house, the intruder is not familiar with your house, right? They don't know the layout of your house. It's pitch black. They can't see anything. They're at a decided disadvantage. And oh, by the way, because they're not familiar with the layout of your house, they are more likely than not going to kick some kid's toy. They're going to bump into a table. They're going to knock over a lamp. They're going to step on that squeaky board in the floorboard in the hall. They're going to make noise because they don't understand the layout of the house. So while the attacker is still trying to observe and orient, you as the defender are well into observe, orient, decide, and act. So what it boils down to is in familiar situations, if you are in a familiar situation, you have an advantage when it comes to the OODA loop, right? You know your environment, you can, make those decisions very quickly, and you have an advantage. Now, that's not to say you are always going to win. If you have, I don't know, 50, meth-addled, drug-dealing, gang-banging zombies that have entered your house, it may not matter that you can observe, orient, and decide and act more quickly, but it does give you a decided advantage. And that's what we're looking for, right? So when we talk about this OODA loop in our own environment, we have that advantage because in our own home, we know the situation. We know where we can leave the house. We know where weapons might be. We can call the police. We can do whatever it is. We know where we can hide, all of those types of things. So in a real world scenario, this OODA loop concept plays out just as it does in the world of fighter pilots. Whoever can observe, orient, decide, and act first is going to win. Now, the problem we run into is, all right, what about our computing environments? Why is it that it is taking anywhere from 2 months to, on an average, nearly 7 months for us to detect bad guys on the network? After all, it's our network. We own it. We should know it, which means we should have the OODA loop advantage. But unfortunately, as evidence would show, we don't, right? So why is it that we lose, right? If we know our environments, if we know what's supposed to be there, if we know what's not supposed to be there, why is it that we lose? And the answer is a couple things. One is, in all honesty, we don't often know our environments the way that we should. There are all kinds of times when I'm doing work for clients of mine, like a pen test or a risk assessment, something like that, and I will ask my client, how many nodes do you have on your network? That would seem to be a simple thing, and they don't even know the answer to that. Furthermore, our networks are incredibly complex, and attackers do a really good job once they gain that initial foothold of sort of what they call living off the land. Rather than throwing a bunch of exploit code all over the place, which is more likely to be detected, the bad guys use built-in protocols, they use valid credentials, and they move throughout our network. So quite often, the attacker has already completed observe, orient, decide, act, and they've done that months ago before we even figure out what is going on. And that, again, it illustrates the significant problem. Now, if we think about this, this should not be happening, because if you think about what we have as defenders, right? We as defenders have budget. I'm not saying we have an unlimited budget, but I'm saying generally speaking, organizations put money into security. Probably not enough from a security practitioner's perspective, but we have technologies like firewall, SIM, DLP, application whitelisting, email filtering, web filtering, different types of authentication, identity and access control solutions up in the cloud, on premises. We have antivirus, endpoint detection response, all of that kind of stuff, firewalls, web application firewalls, network access controls, and that's not even a comprehensive list. We have all of this stuff. We have personnel, we have budget, we have all of these advantages, yet we still fail. Now, the reason why I believe that we fail boils down to kind of two concepts. The first concept kind of just basically boils down to most of our detection technology. When we talk about antivirus, IDS, DLP, that kind of stuff, those types of technologies are predominantly focused on looking for evil. They're looking for a signature, they're looking for a behavior, they're looking for a combination of log entries that denote evil activity is going on. Well, the bad guys, on the other hand, do a really good job of making evil look like not evil. Notice I didn't say making evil look good. I just said not evil. The attackers don't need to make their actions look benevolent. They just need to make their actions look not evil. Whatever our detection technology is looking for, they just need to not look like that. And the way that they do that is to effectively use deception against us. They modify their behavior, they modify the functionality of their tools, they adjust their tactics, and or they just utilize built-in normal protocols and valid credentials to move throughout the environment. I really like this quote. So there's an author named Barton Whaley. Barton Whaley is an author that focuses or has done a lot of research and authoring in the world of military deception. And one of his quotes, I think it was in a book called Practice to Deceive, is in combat, deception can strengthen the weaker side. When all other factors are equal, the more deceptive player or team will always win. That's the problem. The bad guys use deception and we don't. And so we are going to change that. Now, when we look at this aspect of how, right? We want to change that paradigm. How do we do so? Well, the answer that I'm kind of promoting is, instead of looking for evil, we should be focused on looking for abnormal. Now, when we talk about abnormal, trying to normalize an entire environment is really challenging, right? Even things like, what is the normal percentage of network traffic that is TCP versus UDP versus ICMP? Those things can change substantially. If you did identify everything that was normal in your network in, let's just say, February of 2020, then COVID happens. And then, of course, our entire computing environments have changed to pivot towards more remote working and all that. And what was normal is no longer normal. So trying to normalize a network in its entirety is really difficult. So what is the answer? Well, what if we placed resources on our network? Now when I say a resource, this could be a credential, this could be a file, it could be a directory, it could be network traffic, it could be a service, it could be an open port, it could be an entire computer, it can be an entire network of computers. But whatever the resource is, it has no legitimate business use or mission use. In other words, what we're saying is, let's just say I'm going to put a service on the network. I'm going to start up an SSH server. Well, that SSH server is not used in any production sense at all. Nobody uses it. So what we're saying in this case is that we are now defining, for these specialized resources, we are defining normal as no interaction. Nobody should ever interact with these resources because they are not part of the production operations. Therefore, normal is no interaction. Any interaction whatsoever is abnormal, and we need to look at it. Now, of course, there is the possibility of false positives. You could be running some vulnerability scan across the network and trip it, something along those lines. Some bored user could stumble across something when they're not doing their job, whatever. But those things end up being really, really, really easy to isolate if you get that, if somebody triggers one of those traps. So effectively, when I talked about somebody breaking into your house, and they kick a kid's toy, they step on a squeaky floorboard, or they knock over a lamp, what we're doing is we are intentionally placing kids' toys, squeaky floorboards, and lamps on our networks and putting them there in a way that the bad guys can bump into them. And if the bad guy does bump into them, an alert gets generated, we instantly know that the bad guy is there, and we can then take action. We have accelerated that OODA loop, creating a situation where we can win out, which is pretty awesome. Now, these concepts that we're talking about are not new at all. When we talk about deception, this is a quote from General Sir Archibald Wavell. So this is a general, British general in World War II. And what he said is, perhaps the most elementary principle of deception is to attract the enemy's attention to what you wish them to see and distract his attention from what you wish him not to see. Well, this is really applicable in our networks, because if I create resources that have no production value, but I make those resources attractive to the attacker, I can attract the attacker to what I wish them to see. I want them to see my fake resources. And in pulling their attention to the fake resources, we are also pulling their attention away from the actual legitimate production resources. And that is sort of the overall approach when we talk about cyber deception. Now, putting a little bit finer point on this was a quote from a book called Triple by a guy named Ken Follett. And the book is overall about an Israeli deception plot or whatever, but basically he says there were dozens of ways of planting telltales. A hair lightly struck across the crack of a door was the most simple. A scrap of paper jammed against the back of a drawer would fall out when the drawer was opened. A lump of sugar under a thick carpet would be silently crushed by a footstep. A penny behind the lining of a suitcase lid would slide from front to back if the lid were open. What we're basically saying is we're planting traps. So the concept of this one was, if you're a spy and you want to find out if people are checking out your hotel room or whatever, you plant little traps that are going to be not noticeable by whoever's invading your hotel room or whatever, but you will know they're there. And that's some of the concept that we're ultimately talking about. So let's look at how this could work in one of its simplest formats. We're going to look at a tool called Netcat. Now, if you've not played around with Netcat before, it is a very simple network socket creation tool. Netcat can be used to connect up to an open port, or it can be used to listen on a port. In this particular example, we are looking at Netcat, and in the first example, we're just literally setting up a Netcat listener listening on port 80, and the -V says be verbose, so that a notification pops up if somebody connects up. Now, imagine that I ran that on my company laptop, right? I'm a security administrator, security professional. I'm not supposed to be running a web server on my company laptop. So basically I'm saying is, if a bad guy gets into the network, they have no way of differentiating between legitimate web servers and me listening on port 80. So if they're scanning or they're interacting or they're trying to connect up and they stumble across my port 80, I get a note that says this IP address just connected up. Nobody should be connecting up to that resource, and therefore I have an actionable intelligence about what I should do. The bottom example is simply the corollary for that on a Linux box. Now, this is the simplest example, or one of the simpler examples that I can come up and running, having a persistent Netcat listener. One of the problems with this example is that you kind of have to be sitting at the console in order to detect that something's going on. So let's take a look at a different example. In this case, there's a little shell script that we're creating. Now, what this is doing, we're still running Netcat. But what we're doing with Netcat in this case is we're saying any information that is sent to standard out from Netcat So any packets that are sent to the target environment or to the system that's running this by the attacker, those are going to get sent to the logger function, which is basically going to generate a syslog entry. And then we're also saying with that little 2 greater than &1, we're saying any standard error messages, so any Netcat generated messages, which basically boil down to this IP address just connected up, those will also be logged. So now instead of having to sit at a console, we can now take those Netcat connections and dump them out to a centralized logging function, a SIM, a syslog server, something along those lines. So this is a really great way of setting up little traps throughout the network. And if anybody tries to connect up to these things, an alert gets generated and sent to your centralized logging, your syslog system. So really, really, really cool capability for being able to detect bad guys. Now, there's a lot of other ways that we can play around with this. This crazy bunch of stuff here is basically what it's going to do is it's going to set up a persistent Netcat listener. If anybody, in this case, it's on port 80. If anybody connects up to this particular Netcat listener, there is an alert message that's going to get sent to standard error. That alert message is going to include the IP address of the system that connected up. So if somebody at IP address 1.1.1.1 connected up to my system on port 80, I'm going to use all this grep and cut functionality in there to extract the IP address. So now I know that 1.1.1.1 is doing something they shouldn't. And then we're going to take that and we're going to feed it into an IP tables command where we are going to create a firewall rule that will now block any traffic coming from that IP address. So in this particular case, we're not just looking to detect something bad, but we are automating a response. If anybody connects up, now in practice, there are kind of more complicated ways that you would go about doing this, but we're just trying to illustrate some basic concepts here. So in the first example, we can detect somebody who interacted with our fake system. In the second example, we can automate the process of blocking somebody's traffic. Now, you don't have to do those, but these are some simple examples of, using freely available tools to go up and set up a deception or a simple deception strategy. And the fact of the matter is, imagine that you set up a Netcat listener on your system. And because you did that, you were able to catch a bad guy on your network before any other security technologies were able to catch the bad guy. That is a gigantic win. And that's some of the power of cyber deception. So when we look at these, the first example where we generate the stuff to syslog is more of a detection strategy. The second is more of a blocking strategy. So what I might do is when I create fake systems, then if somebody interacts with those fake systems, I want to alert. On the other hand, for my actual production systems, what I might do is if somebody interacts with my production systems in a way that I don't like, they trip one of these traps, then I might block them from accessing that production system so that they can't do any harm. Because I don't really care if bad guys are playing around with my fake systems, but what I really don't want is for them to be interacting with my production system. So you have a lot of different strategies we can play around with. And oh, by the way, little Netcat listeners are just the absolute very tip of the iceberg. So here's another example. What if so one of the things that bad guys will frequently do when they compromise a system, specifically a Windows system, is they're going to go interrogate memory and they're going to try to pull credentials out of memory. Because if I can get valid credentials and then maybe crack the passwords, then I can move through the network and appear to be a legitimate user. So what if we planted credentials in memory? Now, there's a lot of ways that we can do that using a runis command. There's a little GitHub tool you can get off GitHub that can automate some of that as well. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to plant credentials in memory. Now, the deal with these credentials that I put in memory is they're going to be valid user accounts, not production user accounts, but they're going to be actual user accounts that I have set up in the environment. But the password that I put in there is going to be incorrect. I can then use what are called fine-grained password policies to have account lockout get triggered after one failed login attempt. So the concept is bad guy gets on a system, they dump the credentials out of memory. Now, what I want to do is I want to make sure that the password that I use for these is not the valid password for the actual account in the environment. And the password should be a little bit easier to crack than the production passwords. Not substantially, but just a little bit easier. We want the bad guys to have to work to get access to these credentials. So now, once they do crack those passwords and they try to use it, it triggers account lockout. And as a result, we detect the bad guy instantly. And if you get really creative, imagine that you put different credentials on every system in the environment. Now, once account lockout is triggered, you know which user account got locked out. You then know exactly what system that credential was in memory on. So now you know exactly where the bad guy is. Like really, really awesome, awesome, powerful stuff. And again, we're just scratching it. What about if, so one of the things that bad guys will often do when they're attacking a website is they will look for unlinked but commonly named pages, www.something.com/admin. Well, from a security perspective, if nobody knows /admin is there and there are no links to it, it must be secure. Well, probably not, right? So the bad guys will use things like Dirbuster and other types of technologies to find these unlinked pages. So if I intentionally create unlinked pages, and if somebody goes there, we can generate an alert. Or I can get even nastier. What if I put entries in the robots.txt file that reference these unlinked or other special pages? So Google and other web spiders are not going to index those, but a lot of times bad guys are going to go right to the robots.txt file and they're going to be like, oh, you don't want these indexed, so I will go there. So we can actually drive the attackers to the pages that we want to drive them to. Then we can take it a step further. Maybe that page has a login prompt. Well, if the attacker has managed to get credentials somehow, somewhere, we can actually see what credentials are being used while we detect the bad guy just by creating this type of a situation. Other simple things, the administrator or root accounts. What if I renamed the administrator account and then I created a fake administrator account? Well, I'm going to put if anybody tries to attack that administrator account or use that administrator account, we generate an alert. Super simple. I can do the same thing with documents or directories, create fake documents, create directories that seem interesting, but if anybody touches those documents, an alert gets generated. I can set up fake services, fake open ports along the lines of what we talked about for Netcat. I can set up entire systems. I can generate fake network traffic to make it look like fake systems are real. I can do it the other way. I can create a bunch of fake systems that make it look like I have far more security technology than I actually do. So the bad guy gets on what they think is an easy target and they see all these references to all these advanced security technologies. They might just be like, I'm out of here, right? Peace out. I'm going to go find an easier target. Now, we can even take this all the way out to some of the reconnaissance that is done by attackers. So an example of that would be creating fake social networking, creating fake persona that we put on social networks. The fake people have posts about fake technology and fake issues and all this kind of stuff. So basically, when the attacker does reconnaissance, they start to learn about our target environment. Well, what we do is we lie to the attackers. And so what they believe is the case about the target environment becomes actually not what the actual environment is. So when they start to weaponize, when they start to plan their attacks, they're planning their attacks for the entire wrong set of technology, the entire wrong set of vulnerabilities. What we're basically doing is we are creating a situation where the bad guys have no idea what is real and what is fake. And if they interact with any of the fake systems, then an alert gets triggered, we can detect them, we can respond to them instantly. And because we are creating fake systems that are attractive to the attackers, we're also directing them away from production systems, which would cause us harm, which also gives us more time to be able to detect the bad guys. So we get more time, we get more opportunity to detect the bad guys, and the bad guys spend all of their time messing around with systems that aren't even real. And what's even better about this is, let's say that the bad guys figure this out. They now figure out that deception technology is being used. Well, I'll give you a perfect example. I picked these things up at the store. They're obviously Skittles, right? But they are zombie Skittles. And what it says on here is, most taste delicious, but some taste like a rotten zombie. And so if I'm going to go eat this bag of Skittles, I need to do it really carefully, because let's face it, I don't want to taste rotten zombie. If a bad guy recognizes that deception is being used, that will force the bad guy to slow their attack operations, furthermore giving us additional time to detect and respond to the bad guys. So it is a win, 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 win across the board by using these different deceptive technologies. So when we look at this, so here's our so what we're looking at here, we've got reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery, exploit, install, command, and act. This is basically something that's referred to as the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. So the concept is, what are the steps that the bad guys do when they affect an attack? And if we can block or interrupt or disrupt any of these steps, we can mess up their attack. So when they do reconnaissance, we create fake social networking and fake postings and fake stuff that lie to them. Now, because they've been lied to during reconnaissance, they now weaponize incorrectly. When they try to deliver their attack, we are directing them towards fake resources instead of real resources. When they try to exploit, we can even create situations that make it look like an exploit worked when in fact it didn't, or vice versa. When they try to gain access to our stuff, we can cover, we can make the environment look different than it actually looks. So there's all these different aspects that we can take a look at that can thwart the attacker at every single stage of their process, which is, again, really, really powerful stuff. Now, you may have noticed that I continue to use the word fake quite frequently. I actually don't like to use the word fake, because they're not really fake resources. They are real resources that just have no production data. So the term that is often used when people talk about deception is notional. Right? So notional is existing in mind only, or imaginary, but it's oftentimes used in the context of military deception to be these kind of fake resources. And in all honesty, I think that notional sounds better than fake. But you can really use the term notional, fake, deceptive, anything along those lines that you want to use to highlight these resources that we are going to place that will allow us to more effectively distract, deter, delay, disrupt, or detect the bad guys. Now, when we do this, there are a few things that are going to be really, really important. If I want to create resources and I want to get the bad guys to go interact with those resources, I need to understand something about what attackers do. For example, I talked about placing credentials, notional credentials in memory. Well, the only reason that I would place notional credentials in memory is because I know that that is what attackers do. So we start off trying to understand, first of all, understand our own environment. We need to understand what the attackers do. And if we know what the attackers are likely to do, we can then determine where and how we need to place those traps. Now, I do want to be really clear. Deception is not a replacement for any existing security technology at all. None of it. Every other security technology that you've already invested in continues to be valuable. And the reason why, so when there was the conflict in Vietnam, when the United States was involved in the conflict in Vietnam, one of the things that the North Vietnamese did, or the Viet Cong did, was they would place what are called punji stakes in the trail, so that the American GIs would step on it. They're basically sharpened bamboo stakes that if the American, they were buried in a hole in the ground, covered up with like some sticks and leaves. When the American would step on it, they would step down into the hole, and that stake would kind of puncture their foot, taking them out of action, and probably taking others out of action as well, because they'd have to treat the injured soldier. Well, they didn't just randomly place punji stakes everywhere throughout the entire jungle. They placed them on the trails because they knew that the GIs were not going to be going through the middle of the jungle. They're going to go through the trails. So all of the other security technology that we already have in place is still useful, because what it does is it limits the attacker's freedom of movement. Right? If the attacker knows that they have to evade this detection and that they have to circumvent that firewall, whatever, that limits what they can do. So once I understand the limitations of what an attacker can do without getting caught, then I know exactly what I need to do in terms of the deception technology or deception strategy that I put in place. I know that the attacker can't go there, they can't go there, so I know where they're going to go, and I know, generally speaking, what they're going to do, and that allows me to effectively place my deceptive traps, which is pretty cool. Now, when we do this, one of the big challenges with deception and deception technology is that there isn't an inherent goal that is, or there is not a goal that is inherent to the technology itself. With a firewall does what it does. If you buy a firewall, you know exactly why you're buying a firewall, which is basically to put access controls to limit network traffic. With deception, there are actually a lot of different goals that you could try for. Your goal could be to detect the bad guys. Your goal could be to collect additional threat intelligence. Your goal could be to collect attack attribution information so you could follow up with prosecution or whatever it might be. Your goal might be to stop the attacks before an attacker has sent a single packet in anger. Right? So we need to identify what our goals are. What are we trying to do? The other thing that deception adds is, effectively, at its simplest form, deception is a high fidelity, low noise detection strategy, right? So if I can now reliably detect attackers, when I say reliably, I mean low false positives. I did some research and found a number of studies talking about the instances of false positives in an environment, and it kind of boils down, all of the studies that I read sort of coalesce around 1 out of 3. 1 out of 3 alerts that gets generated and sent to like a security operations center is a false alarm. So if you think about that, 1 out of 3 of your SOC personnel are doing nothing of value because they're just wading through a bunch of false positives. Well, what if I could eliminate those false positives, creating more rapid detection scenarios? That's awesome. But then we have to start asking the question of, what do we do with that information, right? If we detect a bad guy on our network, kind of common strategy would be kick the bad guy off right away. Detect the bad guy, boot him off your network. The problem is, once you detect the bad guy, you have actionable threat intelligence. You now, at least, if nothing else, you know what IP address that bad guy is coming from. And as long as you know that, you can track the bad guy's actions on your network. So if you're aware of the bad guy, but the bad guy's not aware that you know, you can watch what they do. Now, if you were to instantly block them or kick them off your network, all they got to do is just change their IP address, change their tactic, and come back a different way. So a lot of times with deception, we don't actually want to kick the bad guys off. We want to watch them. We want to collect additional threat intelligence. We want to know what the bad guys do, because remember, when we talked about setting up deception, a lot of it is, the more we know about what the bad guy's behavior is, the better traps we can set for the bad guy. So when we detect the bad guys on our network, it allows us to collect additional threat intelligence. Collecting additional threat intelligence allows us to do better deception, and better deception allows us to more effectively catch the bad guys, which in turn gives us more threat intelligence, all that kind of stuff. So it is a really, really awesome thing. Now, if the bad guy is actively causing you harm, you can obviously kick him off, but you don't need to when you start looking at a deception scenario, which is pretty awesome. Now, deception is fantastic in many, many, many ways. First of all, it could literally be as simple as some Netcat listeners setting up throughout your environment. There are commercial solutions out there that take different strategies, but one of the things that I will say is, this can be incredibly easy to set up. really easy to set up. The other thing is our deception today doesn't actually need to be all that effective, because for the most part, attackers aren't looking for it. They're not expecting it. This is something new that the attackers are not paying much attention to. So we don't even need to have really good deception today. That said, I can tell you what really good deception looks like with kind of reconnaissance attacks, social networking posts, fake systems, all we can fake network traffic, right? We can make deception that looks virtually identical to production systems. But today we don't really need to, but we can scale it up. They tend to be very low maintenance. There's not tuning that needs to be done. There's not signatures that we need to tweak and adjust. This is really simple stuff that we're talking about. There are very few instances of false positives. And if you do get a false positive, it becomes incredibly easy to find out what it was. I can find out, oh, this IP address just, interact with my deceptive system. Oh, that IP address is a system in our security department that we use for vulnerability scanning. Simple, done. I figured it out. No problem whatsoever. Our ability to more quickly and more reliably detect bad guys on the network means our ability to accelerate that OODA loop is incredibly enhanced. And the fact of the matter is, this stuff is really hard for the bad guys to detect. And even if they know that deception is being used, they still aren't going to be sure which system or resource is deceptive and which one isn't, which means they're going to have to slow down a whole lot. So amazing, amazing benefits, very low negatives, and some incredibly high positives. So how do we do deception? Well, step number one, we need to understand our own networks, right? What's on our network? What does our network traffic look like? Who talks to who? I'm not saying we need to normalize the network entirely, but we need to understand what our network looks like, right? What kind of vulnerabilities are there? What kind of resources? What kind of services? What kind of operating systems, MAC addresses, all that kind of stuff. Then we have to figure out where the sensitive resources are. Where do I not want the bad guys to go? Where do I want to keep the bad guys away from? Now, identifying sensitive resources provides two benefits. Benefit number one is I know where I don't want the bad guys to go. But benefit number two is if I know what the actual sensitive resources look like, I can create deceptive resources that look basically the same as the production ones. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to collect threat intelligence, right? I want to learn everything I can about what the bad guys do. And then I'm going to figure out what my goals are and then ultimately go through and implement as we go through there. Now, one of the things that is often said when you talk about security is traditionally we say that defenders need to be right 100% of the time and attackers only need to be right once. Now, that's not exactly a true statement because that sort of assumes that a single exploit means the attacker owns the entire environment. But the concept is pretty valid, right? A mistake on the part of defenders can be incredibly costly, whereas a mistake on the part of attackers is generally not impactful at all. So the attackers don't worry about making mistakes, but defenders can't make them. Now, if we implement deception and we have placed notional resources all over our environment, all over the place, and the bad guy gets on there, the bad guy can literally circumvent or not interact with every single notional resource on the network but one. But the second they interact with one notional resource, we win. So we are quite literally flipping that paradigm on its head, creating a situation where the attackers now need to be right 100% of the time, and defenders only need to be right once. And that is an unbelievably powerful situation. I mean, that changes the game entirely. That means that instead of the bad guys having an advantage, we, as the good guys, now have that advantage. As we talked about before, deception works really well with existing security controls. It works in any kind of environment, right? If you have absolutely no security, I don't know why you wouldn't, but if you have no security controls whatsoever, deception can work. If you have a really robust, complex, and amazing security program, deception can work in that as well. Really awesome. We also need to think, I said this kind of before, you don't need perfect deception. A simple Netcat listener could be enough to catch the bad guy. But deception, we already know what amazingly awesome deception looks like, and we can build as we need to. The other thing that's really cool is, all right, I'm going to go put one Netcat listener on my network. Great, we have an incremental improvement, and if somebody happens to bump into that, we detect them. Well, what if we take that one Netcat listener and expand it to 5 or 10 or 20? What if we expand that to full-blown services? What if we expand that to full-blown systems, so on and so forth? So the point is that everything that we do when it comes to deception adds to the effectiveness of our overall security program, which is unbelievably awesome. So there's, looking at this, I'll be honest with you, when I first got involved in deception and I kind of figured out what it was all about, it took me like 6 months of going, what am I missing? It can't be this good. It can't be this effective. And I talked to dozens and dozens of thought leaders in this industry, did testing on my own. And the fact of the matter is, no, it is this good. Almost no negatives, relatively low cost, even if you buy commercial solutions, high upside. It is absolutely amazing. Now, when we talk about deception, today, primarily deception is focused on attack detection and disruption. We want to detect the bad guys and or make life a little bit more difficult for them. As we move on into the future, we can start using deception for collection of threat intelligence and attack attribution, and then get into what's called active attacker engagement. So let's take a look at what that might look like. We talked before about SOC analysts spending between 25 and 33% of their time dealing with false positives. That, if we talk about getting higher fidelity alerts, less false positives, the fact of the matter is that can save an organization over $20,000 per year per SOC analyst, per individual analyst. That is a huge, huge benefit. And if you don't have a SOC, it doesn't matter, because we're talking about high fidelity detection. So you don't have to have dedicated personnel to go look for these alerts. When we look at kind of the overall breach costs and all that, going back to some of that stuff that we talked about before, the fact of the matter is this, so the Ponemon Institute cost of a data breach study identified areas that can reduce the cost of data breaches. And so when we look at it, faster detection and response can reduce data breach costs by approximately 29%. Effective incident response, another 14.8%, and reduced complexity, another 7.6%. Cyber deception accomplishes every single one of those. We can end up with an over 50% reduction in the cost of a data breach by implementing deception technologies, which is pretty awesome stuff. But then we take it further. As I mentioned before, if people are interacting with our fake systems, we can learn more about what the attackers do. That increased threat intelligence allows us to create better deception, which allows us to collect better intelligence, which allows us to create better deception. So this is a self-replicating and self-improving technology, which is really, really awesome as well. But where it becomes really, really amazing, and where I think that the magic happens, is right now today, the overwhelming majority of our security technology or our security programs pit a human against technology. The human being the attacker, and technology is every and all of our security controls. And if you pit a determined, skilled, creative, and intelligent human against static technology, the human always wins. But what if we can take that 1 out of 3 SOC analysts, we can eliminate all the false positives, which frees up basically 33% additional resources in your SOC. And what if we took those resources and trained them to actively respond to the attacker, to intercept the attacker's packets, to basically do session hijacking, to create new deception on the fly based on what the attacker's doing? What we're doing is we're turning what is often considered to be boring blue team activities and creating cyber defense ninjas that can actively engage the attacker in real time And the only reason we can do this is because we have high fidelity detection and incredibly good threat intelligence. And by now pitting a human against the human, we truly do take back the advantage. So with this combination of high fidelity detects, highly detailed threat or attack intelligence, very low false positives, less time that it takes to deal with resolving those alerts, it gives us the opportunity for that active attacker engagement, which is pretty awesome stuff. So as I talked before, real-time manipulation of what's going on, modifying stuff, even tying up the attacker while we get law enforcement involved. I know who the attacker is. I know where they are. I know they're on my network. I'm going to keep them busy until the cops show up. And that is absolutely amazing. That changes the entire spectrum of what we do from a security perspective. I will make this statement right now. If we do deception effectively, it will make it easier for attackers to physically compromise an environment than to successfully execute an attack over the wire. I can make it so that attacks across the wire would be basically limited to the pinnacle of nation state attackers. And if we can accomplish that, we win unbelievably. So when we talked before about physical security and cybersecurity, I think that what has long been missing is this is actually a three-legged stool. We've done okay with cybersecurity to combat the technological threats. We've done okay with physical security to combat the physical sets. What we need is the third leg of the stool, the mental or the psychological approach. When we can attack the psychology of the attackers, that means that our stool is now going to stand up. And that is what we have from a deception technology. Now, as I said, this whole presentation that I just gave is kind of like the first chunk of the actual class. I just wanted to kind of provide you with a brief overview of what that actual class is going to consist of. As we go through there during the first day, we kind of go through the content that we just went through. We talk about how the bad guys evade our existing technology. We talk about how you can do deception badly and then how you can do it right. On day 2, we focus on how do you know your own environment? How do you know the enemy? How do you identify goals and components? And then we talk a little bit about virtualization because it's heavily used. On day 3s and day 4, we basically look at the Lego pieces of deception. We look at deceptive credentials. We look at deception ports, deceptive systems, deceptive wireless, deceptive network traffic, all of that kind of stuff, days 3 and 4. We'll bring it all together on day 5, where we talk about some of the basic concepts and maxims of deception, understanding the psychology behind it. We talk about how to plan your deception environments. We talk about evaluation, testing, and incident response. And then day 6 is our capstone exercise. So it's a little bit of an overview. Contact information. I provided a link here for the course information on the SANS website. I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn. I've got a YouTube channel with some videos where I talk with industry leaders about deception, up on Twitter and all that kind of fun stuff. Now, I did notice there's a couple of questions that I'll jump to pretty quickly. I like this. It's amazing how simple the solution of setting traps is. It's simple but genius. Yeah, I agree with you. Amazing stuff. Can we get the slides? So I know that this is going to be posted. I know that it's going to get put up on YouTube and all that kind of stuff. If you shoot me a note, and I'll go ahead and drop my email address in.
And I will add that the recording will be posted to the registration page, and the slides will be posted there as well. So they will
Awesome.
both be made available.
Yeah, thank you, Randall. And in the chat window, I posted my email address, kfiscus@sans.org. So feel free to shoot me a note there. Are you planning to have a GX certification for SEC 550? I certainly hope so. GX certifications happen only after a class has gotten to a certain level of popularity, but I absolutely certainly hope so. Are there any other wider reading that you would recommend for getting further into the topic? So there are a few books out there that are focused on deception. The majority of deception books and resources and all that kind of stuff focus on military deception. So I've done a lot of studying of military deception and then applying those topics to cyber as well. There are a few books out there on cyber deception. if you shoot me an email, kfiscus@sans.org, I will happily respond back with at least some of the books that I've gone through that are focused on cyber deception, and there are a few of them out there. So absolutely, if you shoot me an email, just say, hey, I was on your webinar. I would happily respond back with a response there. That said, I don't see any other. Thank you. Appreciate absolutely. Thank you, Beckett. Appreciate the feedback there as well. If anybody does have any additional questions, you are more than welcome to shoot them my way. Or if you have questions later, don't hesitate to hit me up on the email, kfiscus@sans.org. And if you are watching this in a recorded format, kfiscus@sans.org, best way to reach out to me. But you can also hook up on Facebook, LinkedIn, check out the YouTube channel and all that kind of stuff. So, but that said, thank you guys so much for attending this. I really, really appreciate it. Please, if you think that this stuff is really cool, because this is such sort of a new topic in the industry, I'm going to ask for your help. Go tell your friends about it. Point your friends at my at the YouTube channel. It's not that, I'm not trying to monetize it or anything along those lines, but there's some good content where you can learn about different stuff there. Keep an eye out in terms of the SANS stuff. We're planning on doing a whole series of webinars and even some live stream Q&A type stuff in the future within the next couple of months. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But thank you guys so much. It's been a privilege to be able to kind of yammer on at you about deception. So thank you very much. And I absolutely appreciate you taking the time to join us.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. This was a very cool presentation, and for bringing this content to the SANS community. We definitely appreciate it. I also will mention that we will be adding, of course, a Security 550 channel to our Offensive Operations Discord server. So another place where you will find information about the course, and we'll get Kevin in there as well. So just another resource to look out for there. And for a schedule of all upcoming and on-demand SANS webcasts, please visit sans.org/webcast. And until next time, we appreciate you listening in, and we'll see you then. Thanks, Kevin. Thank you to our audience.